Well, for some reason, I've found myself groaning a lot these days. Or rather, I should say, others have been pointing it out to me. Like when I get up from my chair in the living room, or I reach for something on the top shelf in the back at the grocery store, or even when I bend over to put a golf tee in the ground. Marion will hear me and she'll say, "Are you okay?" I had a friend the other day ask me, "Do you have back problems?" Harrison simply makes the observation, "Wow, Daddy, you're getting old." Although I'm not the only one groaning in our household these days. No, in fact, I hear it all of the time. "Harrison, please take out the trash." Groan. "Clara, please clean up your room." Groan. "Hey everyone, I made spaghetti for dinner again tonight." Double groan. The truth is, groaning happens at every age and stage, if you really think about it. And if you've been around a baby for any length of time, you know what I mean. Or at least, that was my experience. While both my children made all kinds of noises, from whimpers to cries to sneezes and coos, there was always one noise that sort of fascinated me. Just in between their being awake and being asleep, there began a kind of groan. It never lasted long. It was always more intermittent and never very loud. Nevertheless, the sound was always mesmerizing. It seemed to come from a different place within them, a place I had yet to fully understand. That place right in between being alert and being in slumber, and that tension that exists just between our reality and our dreams. Which makes me think that groaning is more innate than it is learned. Or at the very least, I can guess or suspect that we all know something about groaning. Like when you're pushing the lawnmower up a hill through thick grass, or when you see that overflowing basket of laundry that needs folding, or when the teacher says the exam is going to be essay instead of multiple choice, or when your preacher tells another bad joke from the pulpit. But there is a kind of deeper groaning too, one that seems to well up when, well, there's nothing else to be said. Like when we want to shout, but don't have the emotional energy. Or when we try to whisper, but cannot get out the words. Or when we involuntarily utter, inarticulate, before the inexplicably beautiful or terrible. In the early 1960s, the Kingfisher, Oklahoma Free Press was a tiny weekly newspaper filled with odds and ends of local town life. In the paper every week, there appeared a column by a woman named Molly Shepard. Molly was an Arapaho Cheyenne Indian well along in years who wrote in broken English. However, her articles were deep and poignant, beautiful and moving. She told stories about giveaways, about funerals, about weddings, about blanket parties, all kinds of things. They were brief stories, unusual but delightful. Although her article on November 27, 1963, written right after the assassination of President Kennedy, was her shortest ever. She wrote, "Molly has no article today. Molly has no words today. Molly cannot speak today. Molly goes to the house saying, 'Oh, oh.'" Paul must have known about this kind of groaning, or at least he writes about it in part in our reading today. He says, "Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But the very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. Certainly makes sense. After all, his entire ministry is an attempt at getting first century Gentiles and Jews to become one church, and well, we're all too familiar with the challenges that come with bringing people of difference together in unity. I suspect Paul did a lot of groaning during his time, along with the people that he served. I suppose it should be no surprise to us then that Jesus even groans. At least that is according to Mark's gospel. There's a story about Jesus being in a town square when they bring to him a man who's deaf and mute. They say, "Rabbi, can you help him?" And Jesus touches his tongue, puts his fingers in his ears. Then Mark writes, "And Jesus looked up to the heavens and groaned," which I find interesting. Don't you? I mean, most of the groans I make are standing flat-footed, eyes cast down, head in my hands. But the one time Jesus is depicted as groaning, he's looking to the heavens, seemingly on his tiptoes, giving new life to someone who desperately needs it. It's not a groan of despair. It's a groan of hope. And it's the groan Paul ultimately describes in our reading this morning. Paul goes on to depict this groan as one of labor pains, of eager longing. In fact, knowing the Greek word here is helpful. What we translate as eager longing is a word that actually suggests the stretching out of the neck to look for what is coming. In other words, as J.B. Phillips puts it, the whole creation is on tiptoe, waiting for God's future that is most certainly on its way. Which got me to thinking about my days growing up in the Midwest. I can remember sitting outside at night about this time of year when corn was coming into the peak of its growth cycle. If it was quiet enough, if the wind wasn't blowing too much, and you were listening, you could actually hear the corn kind of crackle and pop as it matured before your very eyes. You could literally hear the corn grow, stretching up toward the heavens. Thousands of ears of corn growing at the same time. It's a sound hard to describe. It's almost like a groan. It's no wonder Paul describes this groan being in all of creation. This yearning, this longing within all that exists, it's a creative groan, one that compels all of life to move from the way things are to the way God intends them to be. And it's not just a groan. No, Paul suggests this is the Spirit, the very presence of God in all things. And the closer we move toward the groan of the Spirit, the more we're compelled to respond to it, to recognize it, to share in the reality that God is always doing something new. And you've had this experience before, or at least you've bared witness to it. Like when our youth go on a mission trip and are up close and personal with the groans of poverty, and come back inspired to do something about it. Or when you yourself endured the groans of grief after a significant loss, and now cannot help but be with those going through similar circumstances. Or when you've had a loved one battle the groans of addiction, and are now committed to programs that support others who struggle with it. You see, the closer we get to the center of the way the world really is, the more compelled we become to share in creating the world God intends for us all. Some of you may know that my wife Marion, before coming to Atlanta, served as the executive director of a domestic violence and rape crisis center. A few years ago, they were providing shelter to a woman We'll call her Rachel. Rachel had been living in shelter for about 6 weeks when one morning she turned up missing. The staff looked high and low, but no sign of Rachel. Finally, they tracked down her roommate who confessed. Rachel's in jail. Immediately, the staff began to think the worst. Was it drugs? Was it robbery? Is she hurt? But then they discovered the truth. You see, Rachel had gotten wind that her abuser had hit another woman, a friend of hers. So badly, in fact, this woman was now in the hospital. Rachel had decided he had hit enough people. So she gathered a small group of folks, about 10, and she organized a sort of silent sit-in right on this man's front yard. The plan was to sit in the yard for 1 hour for every person she knew about that he had hit. The plan was 5 hours. Apparently this man got so mad it infuriated him, and each time he came outside and began to scream, Rachel would start leading the group in hymns. He was nervous to call the police, but finally he did, and at the end of it all, he pressed charges against only one person. It was Rachel. But the strange thing is that the protests after she went to jail that night, they didn't end. No, in fact, they grew. People from the neighborhood, from the community, from the church, it grew and it grew. It was odd to see all these different people now gathered on public property across the street singing hymns and shouting chants, or at least that's what I'm told. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. But I suspect it looked a bit chaotic. A lot like wind and fiery tongues. The night Rachel was released from jail and sent back to shelter, Marion went to look for her. But again, she wasn't in a room. Marion said to her roommate, "Let me guess." And her roommate responded, "She isn't going to stop until they make him stop." You see, Rachel was as close to the groans of domestic violence as anyone can be. And when you're that close, well, the Spirit has a way of compelling us to do things we never thought we could. Look, I'm not suggesting this is easy, which is probably the reason we avoid it. Getting too close to the groans of the Spirit, well, it's safer to keep our distance, to ignore them, overlook them, convince ourselves that they're not even there. But I wonder if we moved closer to those groans, if things might not be different. I mean, what might happen if we moved toward the groans of those wanting to migrate to this country? And the groans of those worried about taking care of those who want to migrate here? Or the groans of those who have been victims of gun violence? And the groans of those who want to protect the right to bear arms in order to provide for and take care of their families? I wonder if it might not look like that gathering of people on the street corner in protest that day. Actually, I wonder if it might not look like that first Pentecost. People from different places with different backgrounds, all speaking different languages, and yet, despite their differences, they all understood one another. Make note, it does not say they agree, but they stayed, and they became the church. I've always imagined being in that moment, hearing all those languages, that chaos, what it might have sounded like. I'm not certain. But if I were to guess, I suspect it sounded an awful lot like A groan.